There's a moment, and I know you've felt it too if you've ever stood on the observation deck of a galactic transit hub, where the scale of everything just hits you. Not slowly, not gradually. It lands all at once, like something heavy dropped from a very high place. I'd been stationed at Vexa 9 for 11 months before I really understood what I was looking at. 11 months of watching ships dock and undock. 11 months of watching species that didn't look anything like each other navigate the same corridors with varying degrees of irritation, patience, and bewilderment. 11 months of writing routine transit reports that nobody at the Bureau actually read. And then one morning, early, the kind of early where the station lights hadn't fully cycled up to day mode yet, where everything had this pale blue cast like the inside of a glacier. One morning, I saw something that changed how I thought about humans entirely. Not humans in the abstract. I'd always liked humans in the abstract. Fascinating species, I used to tell people. Emotionally chaotic, biologically fragile, architecturally obsessed with doors. Interesting. But that morning, I saw what humans actually were. And it wasn't what I expected. Let me back up a little. Vexa 9 is what transit authorities call a Class 7 convergence hub. That sounds more impressive than it is, or maybe it sounds less impressive. I've never been sure. What it means practically is that Vexa 9 sits at the intersection of 9 major trade routes, which means that on any given day you have somewhere between 40 and 70 different registered species moving through its corridors, its docking bays, its customs processing halls, and its transit lounges. 40 to 70 species. Think about what that means for a moment. Think about the biology alone, the atmospheric requirements, species that breathe nitrogen-heavy mixes, species that need higher gravity than the standard station setting, species that experience temporal perception differently enough that they sometimes wander into yesterday's departure lounges and get confused about why their ship has already left. There are translation matrices running constantly, overlapping fields of linguistic conversion that sometimes interfere with each other in ways that produce genuinely accidental poetry in 3 languages simultaneously. The station itself is enormous. When I say enormous, I mean that the main transit corridor, the one they call the vein, is long enough that you cannot see one end from the other. There's a slight curvature to it, the architecture following the station's own gravitational gradient, so the far end bends just slightly out of sight. Thousands of beings move through it at any given moment. It sounds like everything and nothing at the same time. A kind of white noise made of footsteps and wing beats, and the soft percussion of exoskeletal joints, and the low mechanical hum of mobility assists and translation units. I loved it, actually, even after 11 months. I would go to the observation deck in the evenings being relative, the station operating on a 31-hour artificial cycle, and just watch. Just listen. It felt like the galaxy breathing. The section of Vexa 9 that everybody eventually ends up talking about is called the threshold. Not the threshold zone or threshold processing or threshold bay 14, just the threshold, capital T. The station's designers had given it a proper designation, Sector 11 Convergence, primary diplomatic entry processing, but nobody used it. The threshold was what you called it because that was what it was, a threshold. It was the point where the main vein corridor split. One direction led toward the primary docking infrastructure, cargo, commercial, transit passengers, the ordinary business of a galaxy that had long since stopped finding interspecies commerce remarkable. The other direction led toward the diplomatic quarter. The diplomatic quarter was different. I'm not going to try to explain all of the political history behind why the diplomatic quarter existed at a transit hub rather than at a dedicated diplomatic station. That's several centuries of interspecies treaty law, and I am a field correspondent, not an archivist. The short version is that Vexa 9 position at the intersection of 9 trade routes made it the single location in this region of space where the highest number of species' territorial claims overlapped, or rather, where they had been carefully, meticulously, agonizingly negotiated into something that wasn't exactly neutral territory but was close enough to function as it. The diplomatic quarter was where species sent their ambassadors when they needed to talk to other species' ambassadors without traveling all the way to each other's home systems. It was efficient. It was practical. It was also, apparently, the source of more bureaucratic conflict per square meter than anywhere else in the known galaxy. And at the entrance to the diplomatic quarter stood the threshold. More specifically, standing at the threshold, every single day, in a configuration that changed slightly depending on shift rotation, but never changed in its essential nature, stood the gate. The gate was not a structure. There were structures nearby, sensor arrays, identification processing units, atmospheric transition chambers for species whose environmental requirements differed from the station's standard mix. But the gate itself was a concept as much as a physical thing. It was the point past which you could not go without authorization. Every species needed authorization to enter the diplomatic quarter. They needed clearance codes, diplomatic credentials, appointment verification, species registry confirmation, environmental accommodation requests, and in some cases formal statements of non-hostile intent submitted no fewer than 72 hours in advance. Every species. Almost. I noticed it first because of a Vreth. The Vreth are, and I want to be careful here because I don't want to be reductive about any species, but I'm trying to be accurate. The Vreth are an extremely proud people. They are tall. They have the particular quality of stillness that you often find in apex predators from high-gravity worlds, and they carry themselves with the specific kind of confidence that comes from being, for most of their evolutionary history, the most dangerous thing in any given room. They have iridescent scaling along their dorsal ridge, and when they're processing something socially complex, something that challenges their understanding of the hierarchy of a situation, those scales shift. I learned to read it after a while. It's subtle, just the faintest ripple like oil on water. I was sitting in the observation lounge adjacent to the threshold that morning, the early one, pale blue light, too quiet, because I couldn't sleep and I'd given up trying. I had my field recorder running mostly out of habit. I had a cup of something that the station dispensary called Morning Blend, and that tasted like warm metal with aspirations. There were 4 beings at the threshold. 2 were Vreth diplomatic staff. I could tell by the insignia marks, those small, precise patterns that Vreth culture uses to communicate rank. They were there to access the diplomatic quarter for what I assumed was a routine appointment. The other 2 were the gate's processing staff. A Keledri attendant named, I would later check my records, Sevanok, and a human. The human's name was Marcus. I didn't know that yet. I'd find it out later. At this point, Marcus was just a human, standing slightly to the side of the main processing station with his arms crossed, and his head tilted just slightly in that way that some humans have, that evaluating tilt, like they're reading something in the air that other people can't quite see. The Vreth diplomatic staff presented their credentials, standard procedure. Sevanok ran the processing checks. The identification matrix beeped once, the way it does when something needs additional verification. One of the Vreth's clearance codes had expired and needed reissue. It was bureaucratic, annoying but manageable. The Vreth closest to the station, the one with more insignia marks, which I understood to indicate seniority, made a very small sound. Low, almost subsonic. The kind of sound that, I would later learn from a xenobiology briefing I'd attended out of professional curiosity, the Vreth use when they are restraining what would otherwise be an expression of displeasure. Sevanok apologized smoothly and began the reissue protocol. And then, while all of this was happening, someone walked past. Walked past the processing station, past Sevenok, past the Vreth diplomatic staff who were waiting, past the identification matrix that was currently doing a recalibration sequence, and into the diplomatic quarter. Just walked in. No credentials presented, no identification matrix check, no appointment verification, no atmospheric accommodation request. Just walked in. She was human. Late middle age, by the look of her. Humans have a particular quality to their late middle age that I've always found difficult to articulate. Something about the way experience settles into them that makes them seem like they are occupying more space than their physical form should account for. She was wearing what I would eventually learn to identify as a transit worker's uniform, one of the maintenance crews that handled the environmental systems in the diplomatic quarter. She was carrying a tool kit in one hand and a data tablet in the other, and she was reading the data tablet as she walked, and she walked past the threshold like it wasn't there. No alarm triggered. The identification matrix didn't beep. The atmospheric transition chamber opened for her automatically, the way doors open when they recognize that someone is authorized to pass. She walked in, still reading her tablet, and the door closed behind her. The Vreth senior diplomat's dorsal scales rippled. And then, and this was the moment that lodged itself in my memory like a splinter, the senior Vreth turned and looked at Marcus, and Marcus looked back, and there was something in that exchange that I couldn't quite decode, even though I'd been trained in cross-species body language interpretation. Something that existed between them that was not exactly conversation, and not exactly challenge, and not exactly understanding. More like acknowledgement. The senior Vreth made another sound, different from the first. And Marcus very slightly nodded. I introduced myself to Marcus at the shift change. This is the kind of thing that either goes well or goes terribly, when you're a correspondent trying to get information from someone who works at a security-adjacent post. You either catch them at a moment when they want to talk, or you catch them at a moment when they absolutely don't, and you can never quite tell which it's going to be until you're already mid-introduction and reading the energy of the response. Marcus went well. He was not a large man, medium build, somewhere in what I guessed was the middle third of a human lifespan, with the kind of face that had clearly spent a lot of time outdoors at some point before this posting, because there were weathered lines around his eyes that you didn't get from station lighting. He had a habit of pausing before he answered questions. Not because he was uncertain, I figured that out pretty quickly, but because he was deciding how much of the full answer to give. We ended up in the corridor lounge adjacent to the threshold. He drank something dark and very hot. I asked him about what I'd seen that morning. He nodded slowly when I described it, like he'd been expecting the question. "You're not the first person to notice," he said. "Most don't, though. Or they notice, and they don't know what they're noticing." "The maintenance worker," I said. "She just walked in." "Clara," he said. "She works the environmental grid in Section 7, been doing it for 8 years. She didn't present any credentials." "No." "The system didn't flag her." "No," he wrapped both hands around his drink. "It never does for any of them." I asked him to explain. He didn't explain right away. He looked at the threshold, just looked at it for a moment, like he was thinking about how to tell a story that he'd told a few times before but not often enough to have it perfectly memorized. "When Vexa 9 was first commissioned," he said, "there were a lot of arguments about the threshold, about how to build the access control system. Because you had all these different species with all these different credential formats and all these different diplomatic protocols, and they all needed to be compatible, but they also couldn't step on each other's sovereignty claims, because the moment the system seems to privilege one species identification format over another, you've got a political incident." I nodded. "The system they ended up building," he said, "is incredibly sophisticated. It processes biometric data, credential codes, diplomatic registry information, appointment scheduling systems, simultaneously, in real time, cross-referenced against about 40 different treaty databases. It took 11 years to build. He paused. And when they tested it, he said, it worked perfectly for every species. Every species except one. I waited. Humans, he said. The system couldn't read us. Or no, that's not quite right. It could read us fine, it just couldn't categorize us. He told me about the initial testing phase. This was information that had apparently been in some low-priority technical record that nobody had ever really distributed widely, because it wasn't, from a treaty law perspective, anyone's business. But Marcus had been at Vexa 9 long enough that he knew people who'd been there during commissioning. The identification matrix at the threshold was designed to read biological signatures, the kind of deep-level metabolic and genetic data that every registered species in the Galactic Transit Framework had logged when they signed the framework agreement. The system would read the signature, cross-reference it against the registry, determine species of origin, and then consult a set of access protocols that varied by species, by diplomatic standing, by appointment status. Clean, logical, fair. Except that when they ran the first human test subjects through, the system did something unexpected. It read the biometrics. It cross-referenced them against the registry. It confirmed, human. And then it consulted the access protocols for humans. And froze. Not a malfunction. The engineers spent 3 weeks checking for a malfunction before they concluded that the system was doing exactly what it had been designed to do. It was consulting the treaty databases. It was cross-referencing the access protocols. It was doing everything correctly. The problem was what it found when it looked up humans in the treaty databases. There are hundreds of interspecies agreements on file in the system, Marcus said. Trade agreements, territorial agreements, environmental accords, cultural protection protocols. And every species in the framework has a record in that database that defines their status, their rights, their access parameters. He picked up his drink, put it down again without drinking. Humans have a record too, he said, but the record is complicated, because over the 400 years since humans made first contact with the framework, they've signed agreements with basically every species. Trade deals, mutual defense accords, scientific cooperation treaties, emergency assistance protocols. Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands. I'm not sure anyone has actually counted. That sounds like a good thing, I said. It is, he said. It's a genuinely good thing, and I'm not being sarcastic. Humans are good at relationships. One-on-one, species to species, they're very good at figuring out what the other party actually needs and building something that works. The problem for our system is that all of those agreements have access provisions built into them, and those access provisions don't always agree with each other. I started to understand. So the system looks up humans, I said slowly, and it finds that under Treaty 7 they have full diplomatic access, and under the Meridian Accord they have unrestricted transit rights. And under the Cultural Exchange Protocol they have academic access, and under the Emergency Response Framework they have priority override access, and under. Right, Marcus said. The system finds 400 conflicting answers to the question of what level of access a human has, and it can't reconcile them, and so it does the only logical thing. It defaults to the highest access level, which is unrestricted, he said, which effectively means no check required, approved by prior treaty, please proceed. He finally drank from his cup. And the funny thing, he said, is that the treaty architects who built the system thought they had an elegant solution. They said, well, we'll just cap human access at some reasonable level and flag any humans who need higher access for manual review. And then someone pointed out that capping human access would require modifying approximately 800 existing treaties simultaneously, which would take decades to renegotiate. And any one of those renegotiations failing would create a legal gap in the access rights of every other species that had a treaty with humans. Because they're all interconnected, I said. Like a web, he said. You pull one thread, the whole thing shifts. He shrugged. It was a very human gesture, that specific shrug that means I know this is absurd, and I have made peace with the absurdity. So they left it, he said. They documented it, they filed the reports. And they left it, and now humans just walk in. I spent the rest of that day at the observation lounge. Not writing anything, just watching. Once you know what you're looking at, you can't stop seeing it. It's like one of those visual puzzles that hides a shape in a pattern. Once your eyes find it, you can't make yourself see the pattern as just a pattern anymore. The shape is always there. I counted, over the course of one standard station day, 23 instances of humans passing through the threshold without any identification processing. 23. A maintenance technician, a junior diplomatic aide who looked barely old enough to be working, 3 people in the uniforms of a human academic exchange program. Someone who appeared to be delivering food, actual physical food, in containers, which I found startling for reasons I couldn't quite articulate. A pair of human traders who were deep in an argument about something and barely glanced up as they passed through. A woman in a medical uniform who was walking very fast and was clearly preoccupied with something urgent. Several more maintenance staff. A security consultant of some kind, I guessed from the equipment case. Every single time the door opened, the system said nothing. The atmospheric chamber processed them through. The threshold let them pass. And every single time, the other beings waiting for proper credential verification watched. I started paying attention to the watching. The Vreth diplomatic staff from that morning came through again in the afternoon. Apparently the reissue had been completed, and as they passed through the fully processed, properly verified, legitimately authorized threshold, the same senior diplomat looked at the gate. Not at Marcus, who was on break by that point, just at the gate itself. That scale ripple again, oil on water. But something else too, something I didn't have a precise word for in any of the translation matrix's available languages. Something between resentment and respect, maybe. Something that acknowledged a thing without quite liking it. I wrote in my field record that evening, I think the Vreth know that the system isn't unfair. That's what makes it complicated. 3 days after the conversation with Marcus, I got access to something I hadn't expected. There was a public record, genuinely public, in the archives of the Vexa 9 administrative database, technically accessible to any credentialed journalist, but buried under about 40 layers of bureaucratic filing categories that made it practically invisible, unless you knew exactly what you were looking for, that contained the original technical report on the Human Access Protocol. It was 112 pages long. I read all of it. The engineers who'd written it were, clearly, people who had spent their careers believing in the elegance of systems. The report was dense with the specific kind of careful language that people use when they've discovered something that the system wasn't designed to produce, and they're trying to explain it without anyone panicking. There was a lot of passive voice. There was a lot of we observed and it was determined, and the protocols were found to indicate. But in the appendix, and this is the part that I kept coming back to, that I read 3 times in the appendix, one of the engineers had included what was labeled as a supplementary cultural analysis. Someone had noted that before finalizing the report, they'd wanted to understand not just what the system had done, but why the underlying data had produced that outcome. Why did humans have so many overlapping access treaties? The supplementary analysis was 12 pages. I'm going to summarize it here, because 12 pages is too much to transcribe, and also because the formal language does something to it. It flattens it, makes it sound like a bureaucratic finding when it's actually something much more interesting. The basic finding was this: humans make agreements the way other species breathe. Not the formal ones, not the framework treaties and the diplomatic accords, although they make those too, but the informal ones, the moment-to-moment ones, the agreements that happen in a corridor, in a transit lounge, over a shared meal in a station cafeteria. Other species negotiate. Humans, and this was the word the analyst used, this careful, precise word, humans connect. The analyst had interviewed a selection of non-human species representatives who had interacted extensively with humans, and a consistent theme emerged from those interviews. The humans they'd worked with seemed genuinely interested in them. Not in a transactional way. Not in a "I need something from you" way. In a way that was, and here the analyst flagged a translation difficulty, a concept that wasn't quite captured by any single framework language, in a way that was warm. Species that had been interacting with humans for generations had formal treaties with humans, yes. But they also had informal arrangements, cultural exchanges, personal relationships at the diplomatic level that had hardened over time into institutional goodwill. And that goodwill had found its way, in complicated and not always traceable paths, into the formal treaty language, which had found its way into the Access Protocol database, which had found its way into the threshold systems paralysis, when it tried to determine what level of access a human should have. The system, the analyst wrote in the final paragraph of the supplementary analysis, is not malfunctioning. It is accurately reflecting the accumulated relational capital of a species that has spent 4 centuries building agreements not just with governments but with people. The access parameter it has assigned to humans, unrestricted, is, in a technical sense, the correct answer to the question it was asked. The question was, what level of access is this species authorized for? And the answer, drawn from 843 separate treaty instruments, is all of it. I sat with that paragraph for a long time. All of it. On the 4th day, I went back to Marcus. He was at the threshold mid-morning shift, the station lights fully up to day mode, so the light was warmer, gold rather than blue. The vein was busy behind me, the particular busy of a transit hub during peak movement hours, that specific quality of controlled chaos that sounds overwhelming until you've been in it long enough to find it rhythmic. I read the technical report, I told him. He nodded, not surprised. He'd known I would, I think. The supplementary analysis, I said, the part about how humans interact with other species. Yeah. Do you think about that? When you're standing here. He looked at the threshold for a moment. That same look he'd had before, considering, measuring, deciding how much of the full answer to give. I think about it differently than you'd expect, he said. Most people who find out about the human access thing, they either think it's funny, like a good joke, or they think it's unfair, like the system is rigged. And I understand both of those reactions. But I think it's actually just accurate. It's the system doing the one thing systems almost never do. What's that? Telling the truth, he said, about what something actually is instead of what it's supposed to be on paper. He looked at the stream of beings moving past us through the vein, the vast, impossible variety of them. The galaxy in miniature, going about its day. Humans are allowed in without permission, he said, because somewhere along the way we got permission from everyone, not in one agreement, not in one document, in 1,000 small moments that added up to something that nobody planned. He paused. That's not a cheat code, he said. That's just compound interest on something worth investing in. I was still thinking about that when it happened. Day 7 of my observation. Mid-afternoon. The threshold was doing normal traffic, the kind of steady flow that characterized most of the station day, with the processing staff managing credential checks in that practiced, efficient rhythm that came from doing the same thing thousands of times. There was a situation developing that I wasn't immediately aware of. I learned the details later from multiple sources, cross-referenced against the station's official incident report, which was itself so cautiously worded that it communicated almost nothing, which told me that something significant had happened. What I knew in the moment was this. I was at the observation lounge. I was writing. The threshold was in my peripheral vision. And then there was a sound that cut through the ambient noise of the vein the way nothing ambient cuts, sharp, percussive, the sound of something going wrong. Not an alarm exactly, more like the predecessor to an alarm. That half second before a system decides whether what it's detecting is a problem. I looked up. There were soldiers at the threshold. Not station security, not the regular gate staff, soldiers. I didn't recognize the species immediately, which told me they were from further out in the framework than the regular transit traffic at Vexa 9. They wore armor that was dark, not reflective, the kind of non-reflective that is a deliberate choice rather than a material property. They were large, not in the way that some species are large due to biology, but in the way that comes from augmentation, from the specific mechanical enhancements that militarized units in certain parts of the framework used to extend their combat effectiveness in variable gravity environments. There were 6 of them, and there was one human. She was standing between the 6 soldiers and the threshold. Not deliberately, I thought at first. She'd been heading into the diplomatic quarter. I could see her pass credential tag, the kind that diplomatic quarter staff wore, and the soldiers had arrived at the same moment from the vein direction, and now she was in the middle of something that had nothing to do with her. Except, she wasn't moving out of the way. I found out later station incident report, Marcus's account, 3 other sources who I spoke to over the following days, that what was happening was this. The soldiers were from a species called the Vorath. The Vorath were a framework member species, but one with a complicated history, the kind of complicated history that generated paperwork and diplomatic incidents and carefully worded statements from multiple embassies. They had a legitimate diplomatic appointment in the diplomatic quarter, proper credentials, properly verified, no issue there. What they did not have was authorization to bring weapons into the diplomatic quarter. This is not a small thing. The diplomatic quarter's weapon prohibition is one of the oldest and most consistently enforced provisions in Vexa 9 operating framework. It's not just a policy. It's written into the founding charter. The station's identification system was designed specifically to detect and flag prohibited items at the threshold, with enough sensitivity that it could distinguish between a species' natural biological weaponry, which was a complicated legal category and the subject of its own set of diplomatic negotiations, and manufactured weapons that had been brought deliberately. The Vorath soldiers were carrying weapons, 7 of them, distributed across the 6 soldiers in ways that were apparently meant to obscure the count and the nature. The system had flagged it, and the station security response, which should have been immediate, was delayed. I found out later that there had been a cascade failure in the security communication system, something about a software update that had been applied to the wrong sector's infrastructure and was currently being corrected by increasingly frantic technicians in a back office somewhere. The response was coming. It was 4 minutes away. 4 minutes is a long time at a threshold. The human woman, her name was Petra Volikin, and she was a cultural liaison attached to one of the framework's secondary diplomatic missions. Petra Volikin had come out of the diplomatic quarter and found herself between 6 armored Vorath soldiers and the gate, and she had done a very quick assessment of what was in front of her, and she had not moved. I could see her face from the observation lounge. Not perfectly clearly, the distance, the lighting, but well enough to read that she was not frozen. She was not paralyzed by surprise. She was doing something that looked, from the outside, like the most casual thing in the world. She was talking to them. I couldn't hear what she said. The ambient noise of the vein made it impossible, and I wasn't close enough. I have her account from an interview she gave me 3 days later, so I can tell you what happened, but I can't claim I heard it in real time. She said, "I'm sorry, are you heading into the quarter? Because I think there might be a hold on the system right now. The credential processor was doing a recalibration when I came through, and I'd hate for you to get stuck in an administrative loop. You know how these things go. Do you have a contact in there who could verify your appointment from their end? Sometimes that's faster." She said it in framework standard, at a perfectly normal conversational volume, with the specific kind of practical sympathy that you use when you're discussing a bureaucratic inconvenience with someone who is also experiencing a bureaucratic inconvenience. The lead Voreth soldier looked at her. She kept talking. She said something about the atmospheric calibration in Section 3 having been off all week, and whether they'd had any environmental issues on their transit in, because if they had, there was a specialist she could direct them to who was very good. She said something about the transit lounge near Bay 7 having much better food options than the one closest to the diplomatic quarter, if they had time before their appointment. She talked. The Voreth did not move forward. They did not move forward because they were trying to process what was happening, which was that a single unarmed human woman was standing in their path making small talk, and the social calculus of that situation was, for beings from a species that operated on very different social protocols, deeply confusing. The Voreth understood confrontation. They understood deference. They understood challenges and responses and the rituals of escalation. A human making friendly small talk about atmospheric calibration, while standing between them and their objective, was a social situation they did not have a pre-existing framework for. Petra talked for 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Station security arrived. The Voreth were directed through the standard weapon check process. 3 of the 7 weapons were flagged for confiscation. The other 4 apparently met some legal threshold for permitted defensive armament. The diplomatic appointment proceeded, delayed by 40 minutes, with an official note filed about the incident. No shots fired. No escalation. No incident in the diplomatic quarter. Just a human woman talking about atmospheric calibration until the crisis window closed. I talked to Petra about it 3 days later. We met in the transit lounge near Bay 7, her suggestion, and when I got there I understood why she'd picked it. Better food. She'd been right about that. I asked her what she'd been thinking, standing there. She gave me a look that was amused and slightly tired at the same time. The look of someone who has been asked a question before and still isn't sure how to answer it adequately. "I was thinking they needed to not go through that gate for about 4 minutes, she said, "and I was thinking I was the only thing between them and the gate. So, you weren't afraid?" "Oh, I was afraid," she said. "I was absolutely afraid, but being afraid and standing still aren't mutually exclusive. Fear's not the problem, panic's the problem. Fear's just information. It's your body telling you that what's in front of you matters." She ate something, thought for a moment. "The thing about those soldiers," she said, "is that they'd never dealt with a human doing what I was doing. I could see it. They kept waiting for me to either back down or escalate because those were the 2 options their training had given them for this situation, and I was doing neither. I was just being a person, asking about their trip. And that confused them." "Long enough," she said. She said it simply, not proud, not modest, just factual. Long enough. That was all it needed to be. I wrote the field record entry that evening. And then I sat for a long time looking at what I'd written. The technical report had explained the mechanics. Marcus had explained the history. And Petra had, without meaning to, without framing it as any kind of lesson, explained the thing underneath all of it. Humans were allowed through the threshold without permission because the galaxy, in 1,000 small accumulated moments over 4 centuries, had given them something that looked like permission but was actually more than that. It was trust. The slow-built, hard-to-define, impossible-to-manufacture kind of trust that you only get by actually showing up, by being interested, by making small talk about atmospheric calibration when it needs to be made. The system at the threshold wasn't broken. The system had read the data correctly. 843 treaties, 1,000 informal agreements, 4 centuries of compounding interest on something worth investing in. And when it asked itself what level of access that added up to, the answer it got back was the honest one. All of it. After the Vorath incident, I became something of a fixture at the observation lounge. The station staff had noticed me, which was inevitable. 11 months of relatively low-profile transit reporting had apparently not been enough time for me to become furniture, but it had been enough time to become familiar. People knew my face, knew the field recorder I carried, knew that I would sit in the observation lounge for hours at a stretch drinking the terrible morning blend and occasionally writing things down. After the incident, a few of them started talking to me voluntarily. I want to record some of those conversations here, because they added something to my understanding of the human access situation that I hadn't been able to get from the technical report or from Marcus or from Petra. They added depth, the kind of depth that only comes from perspective, from seeing the same thing from a different angle and watching how the light changes. Interview: Sevanok Keledri, Gate Processing Staff, 7 years at Vexa 9. Sevanok was the attendant I'd seen during the Vreth credential incident on my first morning of real observation. We'd spoken briefly a few times in passing, the kind of corridor acknowledgement exchanges that develop between people who occupy the same spaces for long periods without necessarily having a reason to formally introduce themselves. She agreed to talk to me on the condition that I describe her role correctly. She was very particular about this. She was not security staff. She was not a diplomat. She was gate processing staff, which was a specific and distinct category that she clearly felt was frequently misunderstood by people who assumed she was doing something more dramatic than credential verification. The thing most people don't understand about the gate, she said, is how much of what I do is about making beings feel seen, not just processed, seen. She had a precise way of speaking. Keledri communication is notably efficient, their language having evolved in an environment where vocalizing required significant energy. But precise wasn't the same as cold. Every species has a different relationship with credential verification, she said. The Vreth find it mildly insulting. They understand it's necessary, but there's an element of their culture that finds the idea of proving who they are to a machine to be somewhat beneath them. The Mendalar find it deeply calming. They like systems. They like the confirmation that the system recognizes them. It gives them a sense of order. The Ulkai regard it as a social ritual and become confused if the processing is too quick, because it feels to them like the ritual wasn't completed properly. And humans, I said. She made a sound that I had come to recognize as the Keledri equivalent of a thoughtful pause. Humans are the only species I've processed that sometimes stop to ask me how I'm doing, she said, during credential verification, while I'm processing their biometric data. I waited. I understand that it's a social ritual for them, she said. I've read the xenocultural briefings. I know it's called small talk, and I know it doesn't necessarily indicate genuine interest in my well-being, but she paused again. I've been at this gate for 7 years, and the humans who ask how I'm doing, the same ones, repeatedly over years, they remember the answer I give them. They ask follow-up questions. 3 months later, 6 months later, they come through and they say, "Did that thing with your daughter work out?" Or, "How is the project going?" Or just, "It's good to see you." She looked at the gate. That's not a cultural performance, she said. That's something else. I asked her whether the fact that humans didn't need to go through credential processing made her job harder or easier. She thought about that longer than I expected. Neither, she said finally. It makes my job more interesting, because the humans who go through this gate without processing, they see me anyway. They don't have to. There's no social requirement the way there is when they're in a processing queue. They're just walking through, and most of them still stop, or wave, or nod, or say morning. She looked at me with the particular stillness that Keladri have, a species that had learned to be very economical with movement. Every species I've worked with, she said, has a concept of in-group and out-group. Every species has a social perimeter, the edge of the group toward which they extend full social warmth, and beyond which they extend varying degrees of polite distance. It's one of the most consistent cross-species behavioral patterns in xenosociology. Yes, I said. Humans have a social perimeter, she said. It's very elastic. It stretches to include whoever is standing in front of them if they let it. That's not universal among their species. I'm not making a generalization about every human who has ever existed. But I see a version of it at this gate more often than I see it anywhere else in my experience. She paused one more time. The system gives them access, she said. But I think they would have found a way in regardless. Interview, Drevahan Voreth, diplomatic staff, not one of the soldiers from the incident. This interview was harder to arrange, and I want to be transparent about that. I sent 3 formal interview requests through the Voreth Diplomatic Mission's communications channel before I got a response, and the response was not enthusiastic. I was informed that the Voreth Diplomatic Mission did not consider the incident to be within the scope of matters they wished to discuss with press. I replied that I was not press in the traditional sense, and that I was conducting a broader observational study of species interaction at Vexa 9, and that I would be interested in any general perspective they could offer on the threshold access protocols from a non-human species viewpoint. Drevahan agreed to speak to me briefly, in what they made very clear was a personal capacity and not a representative one. Drevahan was younger than I'd expected. I'm never great at aging Voreth. Their age presentation is quite different from species whose age shows in a single, consistent direction. And they had the quality of someone who thought before they spoke, which I've always found useful in an interview subject. I want to note that the Voreth soldiers involved in the incident had, through the appropriate diplomatic channels, filed what amounted to an acknowledgement that the incident had been resolved without escalation, and that the resolution had been appropriate. This was not, I was told, something the Voreth did often. The acknowledgement was notable enough that the station's administrative staff had flagged it in their own incident report. I asked Drevahan about the human access protocol. They were quiet for a long moment. There is a Voreth concept, they said, that translates imprecisely as earned territory. It refers to space that a being has not taken by force, but has come to occupy through a series of small and voluntary acts of presence. Space that others yield, because to yield it costs less than what was given to create the situation in which yielding is possible. They stopped, looked at me to see if I was following. I was, I thought. The human access protocol is a formal bureaucratic expression of earned territory, they said. I find the specifics of the protocol, they paused, and I got the impression they were selecting a word carefully. I find the specifics irritating. It is an uneven application of a standard. But, I said, because there clearly was a but. But the territory was earned, they said. That is not nothing. Among my people there are very few things we respect more completely than a being that has earned something legitimately. The method was, another careful pause, unorthodox. But the accumulation was real. I asked about the incident, the soldiers, Petra Volikin. Drevahan's expression changed in a way that I found difficult to read precisely. Not quite discomfort, more like a readjustment. The woman, they said. Yes. She was afraid, they said. I could detect it, physiologically, the Vorath have. They touched the side of their neck briefly, indicating the sensory apparatus. We are sensitive to threat markers in other species. It is a predator's sense. She was producing them clearly. She didn't show it, I said. No, they said. She did not. She stood still and she talked about atmospheric calibration. They made a sound that I was fairly sure was the Vorath equivalent of a rueful acknowledgement. My people do not have a protocol for that. Specifically, we have protocols for confrontation. We have protocols for retreat. We have protocols for negotiation. We do not have a protocol for someone being afraid of you and choosing to talk about atmospheric calibration anyway. I asked what they thought that meant. Drevahan thought about it. I think, they said slowly, that it means she had decided that the outcome she wanted was more important than the discomfort she was experiencing in pursuing it. That is, another pause. That is a quality my people value. We call it weight. A being with weight does not move simply because moving would be easier. They stood up. The interview was clearly ending. Tell me, they said at the door, does the human woman know that 3 of the soldiers from that day have requested information about the atmospheric calibration specialist she mentioned? I blinked. They want to make the appointment, Drevahan said. The one she mentioned, with the specialist who handles environmental accommodation. 2 of them have been experiencing issues since their transit in. They left. I sat with that for a while. Petra, standing at the threshold, afraid, talking about atmospheric calibration, had accidentally made appointments for 3 Vorath soldiers with a station specialist, had turned a confrontation into a service transaction, had, without meaning to, made 3 connections. I thought about the supplementary analysis, the 1,000 small moments adding up. I thought compound interest. Research note, the question nobody had actually asked. In my second week of intensive observation, I did something that seems obvious in retrospect, but that I hadn't thought to do earlier. I went to the administrative database and searched for documentation of the Human Access Protocol from the perspective of other species' official responses to it. Not the technical report, not the treaty instruments, the responses. I was operating on a hunch. The hunch was that if you'd spent 4 centuries watching humans walk through gates that required everyone else to stop and show credentials, you'd probably have developed some kind of institutional position on it, some official policy, some formal language that described how your species felt about the situation. I found 47 documents from 31 different species, spanning 219 years of framework history. They ranged from formal diplomatic correspondence to internal memos that had ended up in shared administrative records too. In one case, a single extraordinary paragraph buried in a mid-century xenosociological survey that had circulated among framework academics. I am going to describe their contents in general terms, because many of them are technically confidential documents that I access through a journalism provision in the framework's public records law, and that provision permits access for research but not full reproduction. The general shape of what I found. Every species that had filed an official response to the Human Access Protocol had gone through, in some form, the same progression. Stage 1, complaint, not always formal, sometimes a diplomatic note, sometimes an internal memo flagging that the situation seemed inequitable, sometimes a request that the situation be reviewed. The consistent theme was, why do humans get to do what we don't? Stage 2, investigation. Most species at some point had done their own review of the treaty basis for the human access level, and every species review had reached the same conclusion as the original engineers, that the access level was, technically, correct. that there were too many interlocking treaties to unravel, that the cost of modifying the system would exceed any benefit, that the protocol, however aesthetically irritating, was not actually unfair in any actionable legal sense. Stage 3, the interesting one. Stage 3 was where the documents diverged. Some species had filed a formal acceptance of the situation and moved on. Some had continued lodging periodic complaints even after their own investigations concluded the situation was legally sound. Some had simply stopped mentioning it. But 8 of the 47 documents showed something different. 8 of them showed a stage 3 that looked like this. The species in question had finished their investigation, concluded that the protocol was legally sound, and then, separately, in a different section of the document, had asked a question. The question varied slightly in phrasing, but was, in essence, the same across all 8 documents. How did humans get here? Not how did humans get access to the diplomatic quarter without credential checks. Not the legal question, the other question, the anthropological one, the curious one. How did a species accumulate 843 treaty instruments in 4 centuries of framework membership? And the 8 documents that asked that question, the 8, had then gone on to describe something. Each of them described an experience, specific, first person or close to it, an account from someone in the species' diplomatic corps or scientific community or trade delegation who had worked with humans, had met humans, had, in the language of the supplementary analysis I'd read earlier, connected with humans in one of those 1,000 small moments. One document from a species called the Marathi described a shared emergency response situation where a Marathi science team and a human research station had collaborated during a cascade failure on a remote monitoring platform. The Marathi scientist who filed the report wrote about how, during the 43 hours they'd spent trying to fix the failing system, the humans on the team had done something the Marathi didn't have a word for. They'd kept asking how the Marathi team members were doing, not in terms of the technical problem. Personally, were they rested? Had they eaten? Was there anything they needed? The Marathi scientist wrote, I did not understand at first what they were asking. I explained that I was functioning within normal parameters. They said, that's not what we mean. And I understood that they were asking something about my internal state that their species considered important to track during periods of prolonged stress. I did not know how to answer. I said, I am uncertain. They said, that's okay. That's honest, thank you. The document went on. I have thought about that exchange many times in the years since. The humans were asking something that, in Marathi culture, we do not ask each other in professional contexts because it is considered an intrusion on the individual's internal sovereignty. But the humans were not intruding. They were, and I am still reaching for the correct language, they were acknowledging that I existed beyond the function I was performing. The document concluded with this. When I was reviewing the Human Access Protocol and trying to understand its basis, I found myself thinking about that exchange. And I found that I did not, in the end, object to the protocol. I found that I understood how it had come to be. I was building towards something in my research, though I hadn't quite named it yet. What I was building toward was this. The Human Access Protocol at Vexa 9 was not really about access. It had started that way, a technical artifact, a bureaucratic quirk, a system doing its job too well and producing an unexpected output. But over 2 centuries of documented species responses, it had become something else. It had become a symbol. Not a simple one, not a flattering one for everyone involved. Some of the species who'd filed documents in that administrative archive had done so with real frustration, real critique, real legitimate questions about equity that deserved engagement rather than dismissal. But a symbol of something real. Something that the galaxy, species by species, had been working out in its own way. What does it mean to belong somewhere you didn't come from? What does belonging cost, And how is that cost paid? And who decides when the payment is sufficient? The Human Access Protocol had an answer to those questions, or at least the beginning of one. The answer was, it's not about force. It's not about dominance or territorial claim or the threat of sufficient violence to make the claim stick. It's about the accumulated weight of presence, of showing up, of asking repeatedly and genuinely how someone is doing and remembering the answer. The galaxy hadn't granted humans unrestricted access because humans were powerful. The galaxy had granted humans unrestricted access because, somewhere in the data of 4 centuries of interaction, the galaxy had determined that humans were safe to let in.